When the first shots of World War II rang out in Poland in September 1939, the Nazi leadership believed they were entering a new era of European domination. The German army, the Wehrmacht, was highly trained, well-equipped, and had already proven its devastating power through blitzkrieg, lightning war tactics. In their pride, they looked down on most potential adversaries, especially the United States, a distant nation across the ocean that had suffered no great losses in the 20th century and was still reeling from the Great Depression. To the German military elite, America was not a true military power but a clumsy giant, rich in resources, large in population yet lazy and undisciplined. The German general staff, steeped in technocratic and racial ideology, believed Americans were only good at building cars, refrigerators, and toys for a consumer society, not at transforming millions of workers into soldiers or military engineers overnight. This contempt was reinforced by faulty intelligence, outdated economic analyses, and deep-seated cultural prejudice. In 1939, when war broke out, the U.S. Army had only about 270,000 troops, smaller than the combined police forces of Germany and France. The U.S. Air Force had fewer than 2,000 combat aircraft, most of them obsolete, and its tank force was negligible. Meanwhile, Germany's armaments industry had been mobilized since 1936 under Hermann, Göring, and later Albert Speer. The German economy was already in a state of total war, while America lived under the illusion of peace, with the slogan "America First" dominating public opinion. From Berlin's perspective, the United States was simply unprepared and unwilling to fight. German analysts predicted that, should a global war erupt, it would take the U.S. 3 to 5 years to convert civilian industry into a wartime economy. They argued that American production was too decentralized, too dependent on private enterprise, and constrained by unions, labor laws, and democratic politics. In Nazi Germany, where orders flowed strictly from the top, America's need to negotiate between the White House, Congress, and industry seemed a fatal weakness. Old impressions of American immaturity also stemmed from World War I, when the U.S. had entered only at the end and relied heavily on European weapons. Germans remembered that American soldiers in 1918 carried British rifles, wore French helmets, and Italian boots. Thus, Hitler and many of his generals assumed that in any future war, America would again depend on its allies and take years to become effective. Racial ideology further distorted Nazi judgment. The belief in Aryan superiority shaped how Germans viewed the world. They considered America a mongrel society of Europeans, Africans, and Asians, incapable of maintaining discipline or a fighting spirit like that of the pure German race. Many officers even saw American women working in factories as a sign of social decay, not as a symbol of economic potential. They could not imagine that only a few years later, those very women would operate lathes, weld aircraft, and power an industrial machine far beyond Germany's capacity. In this mindset, German intelligence on U.S. industry was disastrously wrong. A 1940 report from the German Ministry of Economics stated that the American automobile industry cannot be converted to tank production in the short term due to a lack of high-quality steel and technical expertise. In reality, just months later, factories like General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford began experimenting with M3 and M4 tank assembly lines. Yet in Berlin, generals dismissed these as propaganda efforts. Between 1939 and 1941, Hitler focused entirely on Europe. He believed that defeating Britain would force the rest of the world to submit. The United States, in his view, was a sleeping giant divided by domestic politics and too indecisive to intervene overseas. When Franklin D. Roosevelt launched the Lend-Lease program in 1941 to aid Britain and the Soviet Union, Hitler saw it as a weak political gesture, not a strategic threat. He even ordered U-boats to avoid attacking American ships, convinced that the U.S. would never dare enter the war. But while Berlin celebrated victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans, America was quietly transforming. Inside factories in Detroit, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh, engineers who once built cars and refrigerators began designing planes and artillery shells. Roosevelt foresaw that war would inevitably spread to the Pacific and started preparing early. In 1940, he announced the goal of producing 50,000 aircraft per year, a number that stunned the world. In Berlin, the general staff mocked it as a political fantasy since Germany's total output at the time was barely 10,000. planes annually. German arrogance was also reflected in their social assessments of America. Generals like Alfred Jodl and Wilhelm Keitel claimed that Americans lacked discipline, lived indulgently, and would crumble under hardship. Nazi propaganda portrayed Americans as fat merchants obsessed with money and golf, no match for the disciplined and heroic German soldier. What they failed to grasp was that America's freedom and open society were precisely what made it flexible, inventive, and capable of mobilizing its people with extraordinary efficiency. Between 1939 and 1941, German strategists completely overlooked the potential power of America's private industrial system. In the fascist model, the state controlled everything, from production quotas to labor allocation. But in the U.S., free competition and entrepreneurial spirit allowed companies like Ford, General Electric, Boeing, and DuPont to adapt rapidly, convert production lines, and develop new technologies. This flexibility would soon become America's greatest advantage, a strength Germany's rigid bureaucracy could never match. By late 1941, when Hitler declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, he believed he faced a weak, inexperienced opponent that could be crushed through submarine warfare. He assumed that if the German Navy could sever transatlantic supply lines, America would be unable to support Britain and the Soviet Union. What he didn't realize was that he had just awakened a foe whose industrial capacity exceeded that of the entire Axis combined, if there was ever a moment. In the war that revealed the blindness of the Nazi leadership, it was their underestimation of American industrial power. While Germany relied on forced labor and plundered resources from conquered lands, the U.S. possessed vast supplies of iron, oil, coal, and a nationwide transportation network spanning from the Atlantic to the Pacific. More importantly, Americans could unite around a common cause without coercion or fear, a moral strength Hitler could never comprehend. By the end of 1941, intelligence reports began hinting at a shift. The first Liberty ships were launching. Factories were mass-producing M3 tanks and B-17 bombers. Still, Berlin dismissed it all as British morale propaganda. No one in the German high command imagined that. Within just 2 years, America would be producing more aircraft than all Axis powers combined. Germany's misjudgment of American industry was not merely an information failure. It was a failure of imagination. Hitler and his generals could not conceive that a free democracy, where ordinary citizens, women, and workers had a voice, could organize a war machine more efficient than a totalitarian state. They believed strength came from discipline, orders, and fear. But history proved the opposite. True strength lies in belief, voluntary resolve, and human creativity. By the end of 1941, Nazi Germany stood at the peak of its power and of its delusion. What it did not yet realize was that across the ocean, millions of American men and women were preparing for the greatest mobilization in human history. The industrial giant Germany had mocked was about to awaken, and once it did, no empire on earth could stop it. In the summer of 1940, as German tanks crushed France in just 6 weeks, the world stood in shock at the terrifying speed of modern warfare. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt grasped a grim truth. The United States could not remain a bystander forever. Though no shots had yet been fired at America, Roosevelt understood that if Britain fell, the United States would be left isolated before a Europe entirely under fascist control. And if that happened, not even the vast ocean would be wide enough to protect freedom. From that realization came one of the greatest economic mobilizations in human history, the transformation of America's civilian industry into a wartime industrial powerhouse. Even while the nation was still technically at peace, Roosevelt called it preparedness for peace through strength, a clever slogan to reassure a wary public. But behind the diplomatic phrasing lay a grand national plan. The United States must become the arsenal of democracy. In May 1940, Roosevelt summoned the titans of American industry, the very symbols of capitalism, to the White House. Among them were William S. Knudsen, former production chief at General Motors, Henry Ford, Detroit's automobile king, and Walter Chrysler, founder of Chrysler Motors. Instead of relying on government bureaucracy, Roosevelt chose to mobilize the private sector, the men who understood assembly lines, engineering, and competition, to turn the United States into a war production giant. Knudsen was appointed head of the National Defense Advisory Commission, the forerunner of the War Production Board. Drawing on his experience with automotive assembly, he realized that victory would not come from secret government arsenals, but from the ability to transform millions of civilian workers into a unified industrial force. His famous words, "We must outbuild, not just outfight them," became the guiding principle of American industry in the years that followed. By late 1940, factories across the nation were being retooled. Ford began experimenting with bomber production at Willow Run, General Motors built engines for tanks, and civilian shipyards started assembling destroyers. Yet the challenge was not just technical, it was psychological. After 2 decades of economic hardship, many Americans still hesitated at the idea of war. Roosevelt had to mobilize industry without dividing the nation, a task of extraordinary political finesse. To do so, he turned to his most powerful weapon, his voice. Through his fireside chats on the radio, Roosevelt spoke directly to the American people, explaining that the war in Europe was not distant. It was a war between tyranny and freedom. He warned, if the British democracy falls, the shadow of darkness will engulf the free world. Broadcast through millions of radios, his words changed minds. Thousands of workers, engineers, mechanics, and women signed up for defense production long before a single American bullet was fired. That same year, the Defense Production Act was passed, allowing the government to contract private corporations to build aircraft, ammunition, trucks, and military equipment. This became the legal foundation for a wave of massive investment. Within just 18 months, America's defense budget soared from $1.9 billion to over $26 billion. The transformation of American industry was unprecedented. Detroit, once the Motor City, became the Arsenal City. Assembly lines that once produced cars were converted to manufacture tanks and military trucks. Ford's Willow Run plant, a mile-long industrial complex, set out to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator bomber. In peacetime, the idea of building airplanes like automobiles seemed absurd, but Ford made it a reality. At the same time, Boeing expanded its Seattle plant to produce the B-17 Flying Fortress, while Douglas and Lockheed doubled their output of bombers and fighters. DuPont, the chemical giant, developed explosives, synthetic fibers, and fuels for the front. Across the country, dozens of new factories arose, employing millions and pulling America out of the Great Depression. A turning point came with the entry of women into the workforce. As men were drafted, millions of American women, from Midwestern housewives to young women in New York and Chicago, took up welding, machining, and engine assembly. Many had never stepped into a factory before, yet within months they became skilled workers. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, a strong woman with a red bandana and flexed arm, was born in this era, symbolizing the spirit of the American home front. But the industrial boom was not just about factories. It was about organization and standardization. Knudsen and his team implemented advanced assembly line principles, standardizing parts using the same bolts, rivets, and screws across different models. This meant that plants in California, Texas, and Michigan could produce interchangeable components without modification. That level of precision enabled record-breaking output. A single B-24 bomber contained over 1.2 million parts. Yet Willow Run still delivered 1 complete aircraft per day. Meanwhile, universities and research institutes joined the mobilization. MIT, Caltech, and the University of Chicago launched programs in materials science, aerodynamics, radar, and nuclear energy. The collaboration between academia, government, and industry, unheard of in Europe, produced innovations such as lightweight alloys, synthetic rubber to replace Asian imports, and high-octane aviation fuel. These breakthroughs laid the technological foundation for America's air superiority in later years. By 1941, military orders flooded in, 50,000 aircraft, 25,000 tanks, millions of rifles, and hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition. Yet the United States was still not officially at war. Roosevelt skillfully avoided direct confrontation, choosing instead to aid Britain through the Lend-Lease program. Liberty ships built by Kaiser shipyards began sailing from New York and Baltimore carrying supplies to Britain, and later to the Soviet Union. Each Liberty ship, thanks to modular construction, could be completed in just a few weeks. Germany and Japan saw this as provocation. But Roosevelt understood that even before America entered the battlefield, it was already fighting an industrial war. As he told Churchill, "We shall be the arsenal of freedom, even before we take up arms. Behind this rapid mobilization lay a truth the German leadership could never comprehend: the power of voluntary society. Without coercion, secret police, or totalitarian propaganda, millions of Americans worked 10 to 12 hours a day, driven by a belief that they were defending something greater than themselves, the ideal of democracy. Factories ran through the night, and workers proudly said, "I'm not on the front lines, but every bullet I make is a bullet for freedom." By the end of 1941, America had entered the age of total production. Its vast network of railroads and highways expanded to transport raw materials from mines to factories and from factories to ports. A nationwide logistics system emerged, coordinated by telegraph and later early computers. The United States had mastered not just production, but also distribution, storage, and supply chain management, something Germany, hemmed in by blockades, could never match. The culmination came in December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. In that moment, all of Roosevelt's preparations came to life. Within hours of the news, factories across the nation lit up, workers returned to the lines, and the country entered full mobilization, without a single coercive order. Thousands volunteered for overtime, small workshops shifted to making military parts, and farmers donated metal and tires for recycling drives. Within 6 months after Pearl Harbor, America's industrial output surpassed that of the entire Axis combined. It was no miracle. It was the result of 2 years of deliberate preparation, driven by strategic foresight and the conviction that freedom must be defended through action. By the time Germany realized the truth, it was too late. While Europe lay in darkness across the ocean, the nation it had scorned had completed its transformation. And in the years to come, the vast industrial engine built by Roosevelt and Knudsen would turn the world into a battlefield filled with Liberty ships, B-24 bombers, and the rolling tracks of tanks headed toward Berlin. When smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America understood that this war would not be won by soldiers alone. Behind every rifleman and pilot, there had to be an army of silent warriors, those who would turn steel, oil, and willpower into tanks, planes, and warships. Within months, the entire U.S. economy was mobilized on a scale unprecedented in human history. But what truly amazed the world was not the machines themselves. It was the people who built them. Millions of American women who once knew only kitchens and sewing machines, now donning overalls and hard hats, becoming the backbone of the nation's war industry. This mobilization did not happen by chance. The Roosevelt administration laid the foundation for total citizen production through a powerful communication campaign that turned factory work into an act of patriotism. Posters, newsreels, and propaganda films appeared across America under slogans like, "Do the job he left behind." The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, a woman flexing her arm beneath the words, "We can do it," became the cultural symbol of the era. From offices, farms, stores, and schools, women stepped into factories with a mix of pride and anxiety. They did not know how to weld or assemble aircraft, nor were they accustomed to the roar of machines or the smell of oil, but they learned fast. Industrial training centers sprang up across the country, from Detroit to Los Angeles, from the shipyards of San Francisco to the munitions plants of Pennsylvania. Within months, hundreds of thousands of women were trained to operate lathes, milling machines, welding torches, and quality inspection tools. At first, many male engineers objected, believing women lacked the strength or skill for industrial work. But reality proved otherwise. Women's precision, patience, and discipline significantly reduced assembly errors. Some factories even achieved higher productivity. When women made up a larger share of the workforce at Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, hailed as the industrial wonder of the century, tens of thousands of workers, over 1/3 of them women, produced B-24 Liberator bombers at astonishing speed. What once took months to build could, by mid-1944, roll off the assembly line every 63 minutes. The combination of automotive mass production techniques and collective determination achieved results beyond anything German strategists had imagined. Women conquered fields once considered men's work. At Richmond shipyards in California, they labored day and night building Liberty ships, the vital cargo vessels that sustained Allied logistics across the Atlantic. Thanks to streamlined assembly, a Liberty ship could be completed in just 4.5 days, compared to months before the war. At the Detroit Arsenal, thousands of women assembled Sherman tanks, M10 tank destroyers, and self-propelled guns at a rate approaching 900 units per month, creating a steel flood that poured into North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. A crucial factor behind women's industrial success was a profound social transformation. With men overseas, women not only filled their roles, but also redefined gender in the workforce. The government encouraged companies to open child care centers, provide transportation for workers, and serve meals on site so women could work full-time. Though wage inequality and bias persisted, day by day, bolt by bolt, women proved their equal capability. The American press called them soldiers without guns. They didn't fire bullets, but every rivet they set and every engine they built decided the fate of the war. Millions sent husbands, brothers, and sons to the front, and understood that their labor was another form of defense. In the echoing factories filled with sparks and steel, small photos of servicemen often hung beside posters reading, "Victory begins here." By 1943, women made up nearly one-third of America's industrial workforce, over 6 million workers. They produced more than 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 2.6 million trucks, tens of thousands of warships, and billions of bullets, an output beyond even German imagination. While Nazi factories relied on forced labor and crumbled under Allied bombing, American plants ran smoothly, expanding production without interruption. What stunned the German high command was not just America's technology or resources, but the spirit of its people. They had assumed that a democratic society would be weak, divided, and undisciplined in wartime. Yet the sight of American women working 12-hour shifts in blistering heat proved the opposite. The strength of democracy lay in voluntary unity and moral conviction. Psychologically, this labor revolution sparked deep change. Many women earned independent incomes for the first time, managed their own finances, and discovered a sense of identity beyond domestic life. Contemporary sociologists observed a nationwide awakening of female consciousness. Though most were encouraged to return to traditional roles after the war, the experience had planted the seeds for the modern women's rights movement that would rise decades later. More than a story of numbers, the arsenal of democracy stands as living proof of the power of an open society, one in which every citizen, man or woman, could contribute to a common purpose. As Roosevelt declared, "We do not fight to conquer, but to preserve a way of life." And it is that very way of life that gives us a strength no tyrant can imitate. When German generals finally admitted defeat, they did not lose for lack of fuel or weapons, but for misunderstanding their enemy. A nation that could transform seamstresses, clerks, farmers, and homemakers into engineers, machinists and welders within months. That was the silent victory of the women in coveralls, those who turned America into the arsenal of democracy, and in doing so, forever changed the place of women in world history. By 1943, the war had entered a new phase. What Germany once regarded as its greatest strengths, technical superiority and iron discipline, were no longer enough to withstand the tidal wave of steel rising from across the Atlantic. The true battlefield was no longer fought with tanks and guns, but inside factories, shipyards, and assembly lines. There, the United States, with its vast economic power and astonishing organizational capacity, had forged a weapon Germany could never replicate: productivity beyond the limits of man and machine. From 1943 onward, American industrial output reached levels that rendered every German intelligence estimate meaningless. In aviation alone, the U.S. produced over 86,000 aircraft in 1943 and more than 96,000 in 1944, numbers that dwarfed the combined output of Germany, Italy, and Japan. While the Luftwaffe struggled to keep a few thousand fighters flying amid relentless bombing by the RAF and U.S. Army Air Forces, the assembly lines of Boeing, Douglas, and North American Aviation worked around the clock, rolling out B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and P-51 Mustangs, the very symbols of Allied air supremacy. At the same time, American tank and vehicle production reached staggering levels. At the Detroit Arsenal, hundreds of Sherman tanks rolled off the lines each week, giving the Allies mobility and logistical depth the Germans could not match. Over 49,000 Shermans were built during the war, along with tens of thousands of self-propelled guns and armored vehicles. But perhaps the most decisive weapon was the truck, the mule of modern war. the U.S. produced more than 2.6 million military trucks, ensuring that every Allied soldier could be supplied, fed, and moved at speed. As Erwin Rommel bitterly admitted, without the American trucks, the Allies could not have advanced 50 miles into France. Out at sea, the production gap was even more staggering. The Liberty ship, symbol of American shipbuilding, was produced at a rate the world had never seen. From 1941 to 1945, over 2,700 Liberty ships were completed, along with hundreds of warships, escort carriers, landing craft, and tankers. For every ship the German Navy managed to sink, America launched 2 more. Shipyards such as Richmond, Kaiser, and Bath Iron Works operated 24 hours a day in rotating shifts. Some ships were completed in just a few days, proof of how assembly line methods had revolutionized even a field once dependent on manual craftsmanship. Germany, meanwhile, was collapsing under strain. U.S. and British bombing raids devastated industrial centers like Essen, Hamburg, and Berlin. Aircraft production declined. Fuel became so scarce that the Luftwaffe had to cut pilot training hours, and reliance on forced labor from occupied territories only deepened chaos, low productivity, sabotage, and plummeting morale. The United States, in contrast, had not only abundant material resources, but also a logistics system run with machine-like precision. This superiority was reflected in every Allied campaign. In North Africa, thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and food arrived daily. During the Normandy invasion, more than 6,000 warships and transport vessels, most built in American yards, carried troops and equipment across the Channel. Within weeks of D-Day, the Allies had landed over 1 million men, 500,000 tons of supplies, and 150,000 vehicles, a logistical feat no other nation could match. American industrial power was strengthened by standardization and cross-sector coordination. Every gun, engine, and truck shared interchangeable parts, making repairs and replacements simple. While the Germans struggled with dozens of tank and aircraft models that complicated logistics, the U.S. followed the philosophy of fewer types, greater numbers. This allowed continuous operations without the fear of running out of spare parts. German generals soon realized that war could no longer be won by tactics or strategy alone. It had become a contest of endurance and production. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, tried to centralize industry and imitate American management methods, but it was too late. He later admitted, "Had the Americans not entered the war, we might have held on. But when they turned their democracy into a gigantic industrial engine, all our calculations were meaningless." What made this transformation even more striking was that while Germany relied on millions of prisoners and forced laborers, American participation was voluntary. Men, women, the elderly, and even children joined the home front effort, buying war bonds, recycling metal, conserving fuel, and viewing factory work as a patriotic duty. The difference between coercion and conviction created not just a material gap, but a moral one. By late 1944, as Allied armies advanced deep into Europe, the imbalance had become irreversible. A report from the German General Staff estimated that U.S. weapons production that year alone exceeded Germany's entire military output by a factor of 4. Endless supply convoys streamed from New York, Boston, and Norfolk to forward bases across the Atlantic. American bomber fleets of over 1,000 aircraft struck deep into German territory. Raids the Luftwaffe no longer had the strength to resist. This industrial supremacy was not merely material, it was psychological. Every American soldier knew that behind him stood a nation capable of replacing every tank destroyed and every plane shot down in a matter of days. For the Germans, each bullet and drop of fuel became precious, every loss irreplaceable. The outcome of the war was written not just in battlefields, but in factory schedules and production charts. When Berlin fell in May 1945, the victory of the United States and its allies was not merely one of military strategy, but of mass production, science, organization, and collective will. No German invention, from the Tiger tank to the V-2 rocket, could compensate for the lack of a robust industrial and logistical system. In hindsight, the unbridgeable production gap between the two sides was not just about numbers, it was about social philosophy. On one side stood a centralized dictatorship that treated people as tools. On the other, a dynamic democracy that inspired creativity, freedom, and the belief that every citizen mattered to the national cause. That belief transformed ordinary workers, welders, and engineers into the decisive force that shaped the fate of the world. As German generals like Guderian and Galland later admitted, the war was effectively lost the moment America entered it, not because it had more soldiers, but because American industry had turned war into a problem of production, and in that equation, no one could keep up. By 1943, the war had entered a new phase. What Germany had once considered its greatest strengths, technical prowess and iron discipline, could no longer withstand the tidal wave of steel coming from across the Atlantic. The real contest was no longer fought on the battlefield, but in factories, shipyards, and assembly lines. There, the United States, with its immense economic power and extraordinary organizational capacity, created a weapon Germany could never replicate, productivity that transcended the limits of human and technological capability. From 1943 onward, American industrial output reached levels that rendered all German intelligence estimates meaningless. In aviation alone, the U.S. produced over 86,000 aircraft in 1943 and surpassed 96,000 in 1944, a figure exceeding the combined production of Germany, Italy, and Japan. While the Luftwaffe struggled to maintain a few thousand fighters amid the relentless Allied bombing campaigns, the assembly lines of Boeing, Douglas, and North American operated day and night, churning out B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and P-51 Mustangs, the very symbols of air superiority. At the same time, America's tank and vehicle factories achieved outputs that left German commanders stunned. At the Detroit Arsenal, hundreds of Sherman tanks rolled off the lines each week, giving the Allies unmatched mobility and logistical power. Over 49,000 Shermans were built during the war, along with tens of thousands of self-propelled guns and light-armored vehicles. Yet the most decisive factor was the military truck, the mules of modern war. The U.S. produced over 2.6 million trucks, ensuring that every Allied soldier could move, resupply, and fight with efficiency. As Rommel bitterly admitted, without American trucks, the Allies could not have advanced 50 miles into France. At sea, the production gap was even more staggering. The Liberty ship, an icon of American industrial might, was built at a speed and scale once deemed impossible. Between 1941 and 1945, over 2,700 Liberty ships were completed, along with hundreds of warships, escort carriers, landing craft, and tankers. For every ship sunk by the German Navy, the Americans launched 2 more. Shipyards such as Richmond, Kaiser, and Bath Iron Works ran 24 hours a day in continuous shifts. Some ships were completed in mere days, a testament to the perfection of the assembly line model in an industry once dominated by manual labor. Germany, meanwhile, was collapsing under the strain. U.S. and British bombing devastated industrial centers like Essen, Hamburg, and Berlin. Aircraft production plummeted, fuel grew so scarce that the Luftwaffe had to cut pilot training, and reliance on forced labor from occupied territories only deepened the chaos. Low productivity, widespread sabotage, and demoralized workers. In contrast, America's war machine functioned with clockwork precision, backed by vast resources and a flawless logistics system. Allied operations reflected this advantage. In North Africa, thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and food were delivered daily. For the Normandy invasion, more than 6,000 warships and transports, mostly built in U.S. shipyards, carried troops and equipment across the Channel. Within weeks of D-Day, the Allies had landed over 1 million men, 500,000 tons of supplies, and 150,000 vehicles, a logistical miracle no other nation could match. America's industrial power was reinforced by standardization and cross-sector coordination. Every gun, engine, and truck part was interchangeable, making maintenance and transport vastly simpler. While Germany struggled with dozens of tank and aircraft models, creating logistical nightmares, the U.S. followed the philosophy of fewer types, greater numbers. This enabled sustained combat, operations without fear of running out of parts. German generals soon realized that victory was no longer a matter of tactics or strategy, it was a contest of output and resources. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, tried to centralize production and adopt American-style management, but it was far too late. He later admitted, had the Americans not entered the war, we could have continued to hold out. But once the United States turned its democracy into a vast industrial machine, all our calculations became meaningless. Remarkably, While Germany relied on millions of prisoners and forced laborers to keep its factories running, America's entire population, men and women, young and old, joined the war effort voluntarily. They bought war bonds, recycled metal, conserved fuel, and viewed factory work as a patriotic duty. The difference between coercion and conviction created not just a material gap, but a moral one. By late 1944, as Allied forces pushed deep into Europe, the disparity was insurmountable. A German General Staff report estimated that U.S. weapons production that year alone was 4 times greater than Germany's entire war industry. Endless supply trains streamed from ports like New York, Boston, and Norfolk to the front lines, while bomber formations of thousands roared over German skies, against which the Luftwaffe could no longer defend. This overwhelming production was not merely physical, it was psychological. American soldiers knew that behind them stood a nation capable of replacing every loss in weeks. When a tank was destroyed or a plane shot down, they knew another was already being assembled back home. German troops, by contrast, fought with the grim knowledge that every bullet and every drop of fuel was precious and irreplaceable. When Berlin fell in May 1945, the victory of the United States and its allies was not just a triumph of military strategy, it was the triumph of mass production, of science, organization, and collective will. No German invention or tactic, from the Tiger tank to the V-2 rocket, could compensate for the absence of a vast industrial and logistical foundation. In retrospect, the unbridgeable production gap between the two sides was more than a difference in numbers. It reflected a clash of ideologies. On one side stood a totalitarian, centralized economy that treated people as tools. On the other, a dynamic democracy that encouraged creativity, freedom, and the belief that every citizen had a stake in victory. That belief transformed factory workers, welders, and engineers into the true architects of victory. As German generals like Guderian and Galland later conceded, the war was effectively lost the moment America entered it, not because the U.S. had more soldiers, but because its industry had turned war into a matter of production, and in that equation, no one could keep up.